Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Salem, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The morning of December 3rd, 1894, began like any other winter dawn in Salem. A light snow had fallen overnight, dusting the historic streets where 2 centuries earlier, accusations of witchcraft had torn the community apart. Constable William Thornberry, age 42, was completing his routine patrol of the area surrounding Gallows Hill when something caught his attention. According to his report, filed later that day with the Salem Police Department, he noticed unusual markings on several ancient oak trees that had stood since before the witch trials. The symbols carved into the bark were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and bleeding sap despite the freezing temperatures. Thornberry's report, preserved in the Salem Municipal Archives, describes them as geometric patterns interlaced with what appeared to be letters from an unknown alphabet. Each symbol was approximately 6 inches in diameter, carved with precision that suggested both planning and familiarity with the work. 7 trees bore these markings, forming a rough circle approximately 30 feet across. Within this circle, Thornberry discovered evidence of recent activity that would launch one of Salem's most troubling investigations. Candles, their wax still soft despite the cold, had been arranged in specific patterns. Chalk lines connected various points on the frozen ground, creating what Thornberry described as a complex diagram, reminiscent of a star but with too many points to count easily. Most disturbing was his discovery of human hair, dark and light strands woven together in intricate braids, hanging from lower branches of the marked trees. The constable's immediate concern was that Salem might be experiencing a resurgence of occult activities, something the city had worked hard to leave in its past. His report noted finding other implements scattered about the site, small glass vials containing unidentified substances, burnt herbs that left an acrid smell in the air, and what appeared to be pages torn from old books, the text illegible from exposure to snow and ash. It was during his investigation of these materials that Thornberry first encountered the names that would dominate the coming investigation: Constance and Prudence Beckett. A leather satchel found partially buried under leaves at the base of one oak contained correspondence addressed to Miss C. Beckett of Federal Street. The letters themselves, written in a careful feminine hand, discussed preparations for the December working and referenced gathering the necessary elements as instructed. The Beckett sisters were well known in Salem society, though their prominence had diminished since their father Silas Beckett's death in 1892. Constance, at 27, and Prudence, at 24, had inherited their father's substantial merchant fortune and the imposing Federal Street mansion that had been in the family for 3 generations. They maintained a respectable, if reclusive, existence, employing local women for household work and occasionally appearing at necessary social functions, always dressed in the black of extended mourning. The Beckett family's arrival in Salem in 1879 had marked the beginning of what many considered a mercantile success story, though records examined during the 1894 investigation would reveal troubling undercurrents from the very start. Silas Beckett, then 35 years old, had appeared in Salem with his wife Eleanor and 2 young daughters, purchasing the Federal Street mansion from the estate of Josiah Cromwell, a shipping magnate who had died under what the Salem Evening News had described as sudden and peculiar circumstances. Silas quickly established himself in the shipping trade, his vessels primarily operating routes between Salem, Providence, and ports further south, carrying textiles, lumber, and what manifests listed as assorted dry goods, though customs records from the period show several instances where cargo inspections revealed discrepancies between listed and actual contents. His rise in Salem's merchant community was remarkably swift, aided by what competitors described as an uncanny ability to avoid the storms and misfortunes that regularly plagued other shipping enterprises, leading to whispered speculation about how Beckett seemed to know exactly when to delay a voyage or change a route. The wealth accumulated through these ventures allowed the family to maintain a prominent position in Salem society, though they were noted for declining most social invitations and keeping their domestic arrangements unusually private. Eleanor Beckett's death in September 1891 had officially been attributed to brain fever, a catch-all diagnosis of the era that could encompass various neurological conditions, though neighbors interviewed in 1894 recalled circumstances that suggested something more sinister. Mrs. Adelaide Hutchinson, whose property abutted the Beckett mansion's rear garden, testified that she had heard Eleanor screaming at odd hours in the weeks before her death, sounds that Silas had explained as delirium from her illness, though the screams had seemed too coherent and specific to be mere fevered rambling. George Whitfield, who had delivered groceries to the household, noted that in Eleanor's final month, he was instructed to leave deliveries at the gate rather than bringing them to the kitchen door, as had been the custom, and on several occasions, he glimpsed the daughters watching from upper windows with what he described as expectant faces, like they were waiting for something to conclude. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Josiah Hartwell, noted unusual skin discoloration and what he termed evidence of prolonged systemic distress, though he had apparently not insisted on a more thorough examination, later explaining to colleagues that Silas Beckett had been most insistent about maintaining his wife's dignity in death. Following Eleanor's passing, the sisters had withdrawn almost entirely from Salem society, maintaining only the most necessary connections for household management and business affairs, their black mourning attire becoming a permanent fixture that neighbors noted they wore even 3 years after their mother's death. The discovery of Eleanor Beckett's journal in the Salem Historical Society archives in November 1894 had been accidental, found among donated papers from the estate of Dr. Hartwell, who had died earlier that year, and its contents would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of the Beckett family's activities, containing, as it did, repeated references to the obligations that bind our bloodline and desperate entries about the covenant that grandfather signed that demands its price from each generation, along with increasingly frantic notations about protecting her daughters from what they must become when I am gone. The October of 1894 brought to Salem an unseasonable chill, and with it a series of disappearances that would transform Constable Thornbury's discovery at Gallows Hill from a curiosity into the catalyst for a full criminal investigation. Mary Whitmore, aged 19, was the first to vanish, last seen by her landlady Mrs. Catherine Ellis on the evening of October 8th, walking in the direction of Federal Street, where she had recently taken employment as a seamstress with the Beckett sisters. Her failure to return that night, initially attributed to perhaps staying late to finish urgent work, though concern grew when she failed to appear the following morning. Sarah Putnam, 22 years old and known for her exceptional skill with embroidery, disappeared on October 15th under remarkably similar circumstances, having told her fellow boarders at Mrs. Henley's lodging house that the Beckett sisters had requested her assistance with what she described as special garments for December occasions, her personal effects left neatly arranged in her room as if she expected to return shortly. The third disappearance, that of Rebecca Morse on October 20th, finally prompted official law enforcement involvement, as Rebecca's uncle, prominent merchant Thomas Morse, demanded action from Sheriff James Holbrook. refusing to accept the initial dismissal of the young women as having likely eloped or sought employment elsewhere, a common explanation for missing working-class women in that era. Sheriff Holbrook's investigation quickly revealed disturbing commonalities among the three cases, most significantly that all three women had been recently employed by the Beckett household, hired through discreet newspaper advertisements seeking young women of good character for delicate needlework, evening hours required, generous compensation for discretion. Advertisements that had appeared regularly over the previous 3 years, though few respondents seemed to remain in the sisters' employment for long. The investigation took a decidedly darker turn with the discovery of Mary Whitmore's diary, found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her rented room by Mrs. Ellis during a thorough cleaning prompted by the need to re-let the space, its pages revealing an increasingly troubled state of mind following her initial visits to the Beckett mansion. Her entries, written in a careful hand that grew more erratic as the dates progressed, described dreams that began the very night after her first interview with Constance Beckett, visions of dark corridors that extend far beyond what the house should contain, and voices calling from behind walls that should not have spaces behind them. Dreams that she noted seemed more vivid than her waking hours. Most disturbing was her entry dated October 7th, the day before her disappearance, which read in part, "Miss Prudence says the dreams are preparing me, that soon I will understand why they chose me, why my needlework must be so precise for the garments that no living person will wear. I should flee. I know I should flee. But each morning I wake with such certainty that I must return, that something unfinished awaits me there. Mother always said I was too trusting. I fear she was right. If anyone reads this, and I have not returned, look not for me among the living." The diary contained sketches of the patterns she had been instructed to embroider, symbols that bore disturbing similarity to those Constable Thornberry had found carved into the trees at Gallows Hill, though Mary could not have known of those discoveries, suggesting a connection that Sheriff Holbrook found deeply troubling as he prepared to confront the Beckett sisters about their missing employees. Martha Prescott, 58 years of age, and employed by the Beckett family from 1885 until her abrupt dismissal in January 1891, provided sworn testimony to Sheriff Holbrook on December 7th, 1894, that would prove instrumental in understanding the true nature of the household's activities. Prescott, a widow of impeccable reputation who had subsequently found employment with the respectable Thornton family, initially showed great reluctance to discuss her time with the Becketts, requiring both legal compulsion and assurances of protection before agreeing to speak, her hands trembling as she recounted experiences that had clearly left lasting psychological scars. Her testimony began with seemingly minor peculiarities that had accumulated into a pattern of deep wrongness. The family's insistence that certain rooms remain locked at all times, with keys held only by Silas and later by Constance. The strange dietary restrictions that prohibited meat consumption during certain lunar phases, while requiring the ingestion of bitter herbal preparations that left the tongue blackened, and the deliveries that came always at night through the rear entrance, heavy crates that Prescott was forbidden to examine, but which leaked dark fluids and emanated chemical odors she recognized as including mercury and sulfur. Most disturbing were her accounts of discovering the sisters with their mother in the cellar during what should have been the sleeping hours. Having descended to investigate sounds she initially attributed to rats, but which proved to be rhythmic chanting in what she described as words that hurt the ears to hear, that seemed to twist in the air like living things. Eleanor Beckett, already showing signs of her final illness, had been seated in a chair at the center of chalk diagrams, while her daughters moved around her in precise patterns. applying substances to her skin that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight, the entire scene so disturbing that Prescott had fled back to her quarters and spent the remainder of the night in prayer. The household's unusual supply requirements had troubled local merchants, who later corroborated Prescott's testimony, confirming deliveries of vast quantities of salt, far more than any normal preservation needs would require, alongside regular shipments of mercury, antimony, and exotic herbs from ships returning from the Caribbean and South America, substances that filled the house with an ever-present medicinal smell that Prescott said made her feel as if my thoughts were not entirely my own. Her employment had ended abruptly on January 15th. 1,891, following an incident in the attic that Prescott could barely bring herself to describe, her voice dropping to a whisper as she told of hearing Eleanor Beckett's voice calling for help from the locked upper rooms, of using a forgotten key to investigate, only to find something that caused her to flee the house immediately, accepting her dismissal without protest and her final wages without question. When pressed by Sheriff Holbrook for details, Prescott would only say that what she saw in that attic room wore Mrs. Beckett's face but was not Mrs. Beckett, could not have been Mrs. Beckett, for the proportions were wrong, the movements were wrong, and the smile, God help me, the smile was something that could not exist on any human face. Her testimony ending with the desperate assertion that she had moved her lodgings 3 times since leaving the Beckett employ, because she could still sometimes hear that voice calling her name in the hours before dawn. The compilation of reports from Salem's night watchmen, assembled by Sheriff Holbrook's deputies from the police department's files, revealed a pattern of disturbing observations dating back to the spring of 1,894 that had been dismissed as isolated incidents until the disappearances brought new scrutiny to nocturnal activities in the city, beginning with a report filed by Watchman Samuel Morse on April 3rd, 1,894. Multiple officers had documented sightings of cloaked figures moving through Salem's streets in the hours between midnight and dawn, always in pairs or small groups, their movements described as purposeful yet unnatural, gliding rather than walking, maintaining perfect synchronization as if controlled by a single will. The reports showed an escalation in frequency through the summer months, with Watchman Oliver Putnam noting on July 15th that he had observed no fewer than 7 such figures emerging from the vicinity of Federal Street, their faces obscured by deep hoods, carrying what appeared to be covered baskets that emanated a phosphorescent glow visible even through the cloth. The Beckett mansion itself had been the subject of numerous reports, with strange lights observed in windows that should have been dark, particularly in the upper floors and cellar, lights that Watchman Charles Hartley described as not the warm glow of gas or lamp, but a cold radiance that seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a diseased heartbeat. Most detailed and disturbing was the account of Thomas Endicott, a veteran watchman of 15 years' service with an impeccable record, who, on the night of September 22nd, 1,894, had made the decision to follow 2 cloaked figures he observed, leaving the rear gate of the Beckett property at 2:30 in the morning. His report, written in an increasingly agitated hand as it progressed, described trailing the figures through empty streets to the Charter Street burying ground, where they produced tools from beneath their cloaks and began what Endicott described as systematic excavation at specific graves, not the random vandalism of resurrectionist body snatchers, but careful collection of soil from particular plots. The figures, whom Endicott believed to be female based on their stature and movements, consulted what appeared to be a map or diagram, taking small amounts of earth from 7 different graves, all dating from the late 1600s, placing each sample in separate containers with methodical precision. What happened next, according to Endicott's report, challenged his sanity and ultimately led to his complete breakdown. As he watched from behind a large monument, one figure lowered her hood, revealing features he recognized as belonging to Prudence Beckett. But her face in the moonlight appeared somehow wrong, as if the bones beneath had been rearranged into a configuration that merely approximated human features. When she turned in his direction, Endicott wrote, her eyes reflected light like an animal's, and she smiled with too many teeth. A sight that sent him fleeing back to the police station, where he collapsed in hysterics, subsequently refusing all night duty assignments and eventually resigning from the force entirely. His final statement to Sheriff Holbrook being that there are things walking in Salem that wear human faces but are not human, and the Beckett sisters are among them, or perhaps they are what commands them, and God help us all when they complete whatever work they are about. The discovery of Dr. Cornelius Wade's private medical records in December 1894 occurred under circumstances that only deepened the mystery surrounding the Beckett family. Found as they were in a hidden compartment of his abandoned residence by the new owners who had purchased the property at auction following his unexplained disappearance in October 1891, just weeks after Eleanor Beckett's death. Dr. Wade, a respected physician who had maintained a thriving practice in Salem for 23 years, had been the Beckett family's personal physician since their arrival in 1879, and his confidential notes regarding Eleanor's final illness painted a deeply disturbing picture that bore little resemblance to the official diagnosis of brain fever. His entries, written in the precise medical Latin of his training but increasingly interspersed with agitated personal observations, described symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. Patient exhibits what can only be termed corporeal dissolution, as if the very substance of her flesh were being systematically consumed from within by some unknown process, leaving the skin loose and hanging like an ill-fitted garment over a diminishing frame. Wade documented his growing alarm as Eleanor's condition progressed, noting that her weight loss far exceeded what could be explained by reduced appetite, that her skin took on a translucent quality through which subcutaneous structures became disturbingly visible, and most unnervingly, that she seemed to be aging in reverse in certain aspects, while simultaneously deteriorating in others, her hair regaining youthful luster even as her body wasted away. The strange marks on her body, which Wade meticulously illustrated in his notes, appeared to be neither injuries nor natural skin conditions, but rather what he described as systematic patterns of subcutaneous alteration, as if something were being written upon the flesh from within, marks that appeared to move and change position between examinations, forming symbols that Wade attempted to copy, but noted made him feel unsettled in mind and spirit when he looked upon them too long. His final entries regarding Eleanor showed increasing professional distress, with one dated September 3rd, 1891, stating, "I am forced to conclude that what afflicts Mrs. Beckett is no natural disease, but something that challenges the very foundations of medical science, a consumption not of the body by disease, but of the essence of life itself by some process I cannot comprehend, and facilitated, I fear, by the patient's own family, who seem not distressed but expectant, as if her dissolution were not a tragedy but a transformation long anticipated. Dr. Wade's disappearance on October 15th, 1891, exactly 1 month after Eleanor's death, had been sudden and complete, his practice abandoned with patients' appointments still scheduled, his residence left with meals half prepared and clothing in wardrobes, as if he had stepped out momentarily and simply never returned. The only explanation found among his papers was a letter addressed to his colleague, Dr. Marcus Thornberry of Boston, dated October 14th, which read in part, "I can no longer remain silent about what I witnessed in the Beckett household during Eleanor's final hours. Practices that violate every principle of medicine and humanity. Rituals that seemed designed not to ease her passing, but to capture something essential as she died. The daughters, and even Eleanor herself, participating in acts I dare not fully describe, lest I be thought mad, but which have convinced me that the Becketts are involved in something ancient and unspeakable that uses human dissolution as mere fuel for purposes I pray I do not live to understand." The events on Hutchinson Street, which ran parallel to the rear gardens of the Beckett mansion, and had long been considered one of Salem's most peaceful residential areas, began in earnest during the first week of November 1894, though subsequent investigation would reveal earlier incidents that residents had been reluctant to report for fear of being thought hysterical or mad. The initial complaints filed with the Salem Police Department spoke of strange chanting heard in the pre-dawn hours, described by Mr. Jonathan Hutchinson, whose family had given the street its name, as voices speaking in unison but in no language that Christian folk should know, words that seemed to crawl through the air and into one's very bones, making sleep impossible and prayer necessary. Multiple residents corroborated these reports, with Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell noting that the chanting seemed to emanate not from any single location, but from beneath the ground itself, rising up through cellars and foundations, accompanied by vibrations that caused pictures to fall from walls and dishes to rattle in cupboards. The discovery of deceased pets began on November 9th, when young Timothy Cooper found his family's cat behind their carriage house, the animal completely drained of blood through 2 precise punctures in its throat, its body arranged in what his mother would later describe as a deliberate pose, as if it were merely sleeping, but with its eyes wide open and reflecting something that wasn't there. Over the following week, 17 pets were found in similar condition throughout Hutchinson Street, each drained with surgical precision, each positioned in specific locations that, when mapped by Deputy Sullivan, formed a pattern centered on the rear wall of the Beckett property. Mrs. Adelaide Cooper's testimony, given under oath on November 18th, provided the most direct evidence of the Beckett sisters' involvement in these disturbing events, describing how she had been awakened at 3 a.m. by a scraping sound in her garden, and upon peering through her bedroom window, observed Prudence Beckett kneeling in the frozen flower beds, her hands moving through the frost-hardened earth, as if it were loose sand, extracting what appeared to be small objects that glowed faintly in the darkness. She was speaking to them, Mrs. Cooper stated, to whatever she was pulling from my garden, speaking as one might to a beloved pet or infant, and when she stood, I saw her pockets were bulging with whatever she had collected, and the expression on her face in the moonlight was one of such terrible joy that I fell to my knees and could not rise until dawn. The subsequent investigation of the Cooper garden and other properties along Hutchinson Street revealed a network of shallow burials, small bones identified by Dr. Thornberry as belonging to various animals but arranged in precise geometric patterns, interspersed with botanical specimens that Professor Gerald Whitmore of Harvard, consulted by Sheriff Holbrook, identified as including plants not native to North America, some of which were thought extinct, others which he claimed should not be able to grow in this climate, yet showed signs of having been cultivated here for years, possibly decades. Most disturbing were the properties of these plants when tested, with several specimens causing immediate necrosis in laboratory animals, while others induced states that Professor Whitmore described as apparent death followed by violent reanimation, leading him to seal his samples and refuse further involvement in the investigation, stating in his final letter that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, and what the Beckett sisters are cultivating serves purposes that natural philosophy was never meant to understand. Sheriff Holbrook's expanded investigation into the disappearances of Mary Whitmore, Sarah Putnam, and Rebecca Morse unveiled a pattern of vanishings that stretched back far beyond the October incidents. With his deputy's painstaking review of missing persons reports, employment records, and newspaper archives, revealing that at least 7 other young women had disappeared under similar circumstances over the preceding 3 years, all having been employed at some point by the Beckett household. The pattern that emerged from these cases was as disturbing as it was consistent. Emma Thornfield, age 20, disappeared in March 1892. Alice Goodwin, 19, in September 1892. Margaret Chase, 21, in January 1893. Helen Proctor, 18, in April 1893. Dorothy Mills, 22, in August 1893. Frances Blackwood, 20, in December 1893. And Julia Carey, 19, in May 1894, all sharing the common characteristics of being orphans or estranged from their families, having no close relatives to pursue investigations, and all having answered similar advertisements for seamstresses posted by the Beckett sisters. Deputy Patrick O'Sullivan's discovery of employment contracts in the county clerk's office, filed as required by law for domestic servants, revealed documents that contained highly unusual clauses that should have raised concerns but had apparently gone unexamined, including requirements for absolute availability for evening and nighttime work, as the nature of the tasks demand, complete discretion regarding all household matters observed or overheard, and most disturbing, agreement to participate in historical and cultural demonstrations as required by the employers, with a notation that breach of any terms would result in penalties extending beyond mere termination of employment. The contracts also included peculiar medical requirements, insisting that employees submit to monthly examinations by the family physician to ensure constitutional suitability for the specialized work required, and that they maintain specific dietary restrictions during their employment, abstaining from certain foods while consuming others that would be provided by the household. The investigation took a crucial turn when Mrs. Catherine Putnam, mother of the missing Sarah, came forward with a letter she had received from her daughter dated October 12th, just 3 days before her disappearance, which she had initially withheld out of fear it would reflect poorly on her daughter's reputation, but now provided in desperation for answers. Sarah's letter, written in an excited but increasingly erratic hand, spoke of the great honor the Beckett sisters have bestowed upon me, selecting me for participation in their grand working scheduled for the December new moon, describing preparations that included learning the proper words that must be spoken without error and practicing movements that seem like dance but serve a greater purpose, while assuring her mother that, though the work is strange and sometimes frightening, the rewards promised are beyond anything our humble station could otherwise achieve. Most disturbing was Sarah's mention that the other girls who came before have already gone ahead to prepare the way, and soon I will join them in their glorious task, a phrase that Sheriff Holbrook interpreted with growing dread as he compared it to the testimony of Martha Prescott and the evidence accumulating against the Beckett sisters, leading him to accelerate his investigation as December approached, fearing that whatever grand working the sisters had planned would claim more victims if not stopped. The examination of records at the Salem Marine Insurance Company, undertaken by Deputy Chief Inspector Morrison with the assistance of the company's increasingly nervous clerks, revealed a pattern of claims and payments that transformed Silas Beckett from successful merchant to suspected orchestrator of maritime disasters spanning nearly 15 years. Between 1879 and his death in 1892, Beckett had filed 17 insurance claims for total or partial loss of vessels, a number that initially seemed high, but not impossibly so until the circumstances of each loss were examined in detail, revealing that every ship had disappeared under remarkably similar conditions: calm weather, experienced crews, well-maintained vessels, yet complete vanishment without trace of wreckage or survivors. The crew manifests, meticulously preserved in the company's files, showed disturbing patterns when cross-referenced with port records and family inquiries from across New England, with at least 43 sailors listed on various Beckett vessels, having no verifiable history before their employment and no traceable connections after their ships' disappearances, as if they had materialized solely to crew these doomed vessels. Most troubling was the discovery by clerk Timothy Hawthorne of a hidden ledger compartment containing coded correspondence between Silas Beckett and parties in Providence, Boston, and as far south as Baltimore. Letters that, when partially decoded by Professor Emmanuel Goldstein of Salem Academy, revealed references to fulfillment of the ancient agreement established in the time of our forebears, and payments described not in monetary terms but as rendered in the old currency that predates coin, with specific mention of 37 delivered as promised, and the harvest of the seas proves bountiful for our purposes. The correspondence, dated from 1881, contained particularly disturbing content, with Silas writing to an unnamed recipient in Providence: "The Charlotte Marie will depart on the tide of the new moon with a full complement as requested, all men without families or connections as specified. Captain Morrison has been prepared with the necessary words, and will ensure the vessel reaches the prescribed coordinates where the deep currents run black," followed by a response that stated simply, "The depths are hungry, and you shall be rewarded as our compact demands." Investigation into similar patterns at other New England ports revealed a network of suspicious maritime losses extending from Portland to New Haven, all involving vessels with connections to a small group of merchant families who seemed to prosper even as their ships vanished, leading Inspector Morrison to compile a list of names that appeared repeatedly in correspondence and insurance documents, names that traced back to Salem's founding families and bore disturbing connections to those accused but never convicted during the witch trials. The final piece of evidence that convinced Sheriff Holbrook of a conspiracy extending far beyond the Beckett sisters was a letter from Silas to his wife Eleanor, dated just months before his death, discovered in a false bottom drawer of his desk at the insurance company, which read, "My dearest, the payments grow ever more demanding, and I fear we have traded our daughter's futures for temporal wealth. For the agreements I have honored will pass to them as they passed to me, and the hunger of those we serve is never sated, only deferred. And what they will demand of constance and prudence when they come of age makes my soul shrivel within me. Yet I am bound by oaths that predate my birth and will extend beyond my death. May God forgive what I have done and what our children must do." Father Michael O'Brien's involvement in the Beckett investigation began on December 10th, 1894, following a confession that had left him deeply shaken, though the sanctity of the confessional prevented him from revealing the penitent's identity. He felt compelled by both duty and conscience to investigate claims of devil worship and worse occurring nightly at the Beckett mansion on Federal Street. Father O'Brien, a learned man of 45 years who had studied at the Vatican before his assignment to Salem's Street, Mary's parish, documented his encounters with meticulous care in a journal that would later be discovered among his effects when he failed to board the ship to his hastily arranged new assignment in California. His first visit to the Beckett mansion on December 11th was received with what he described as a courtesy so perfect it felt like mockery, with Constance Beckett greeting him in flawless Latin before switching to what Professor James Whitfield of Harvard would later identify from O'Brien's phonetic transcriptions as a dialect of Aramaic that had supposedly been extinct for over 1,000 years. The priest noted with growing alarm that when Prudence joined them, the sisters engaged in what seemed to be a deliberate display of linguistic knowledge, conversing briefly in languages O'Brien recognized as ancient Greek, medieval Hebrew, and what he believed to be pre-Christian Coptic, all spoken with native fluency, despite neither sister having traveled abroad or attended university. Most disturbing to O'Brien were the physical manifestations that occurred in the sisters' presence. His blessed rosary, which he had carried for 20 years, began to tarnish visibly during their meeting, the silver turning black as if aged centuries in minutes, while the holy water in the vial he always carried began to steam and bubble despite the cool temperature of the room. His attempts to bless the house were met with what he described as polite amusement tinged with something darker, and when he spoke certain prayers, the sisters would finish the Latin phrases with him, though their versions contained subtle alterations that transformed blessings into something he feared were their opposite. During his tour of the house, which the sisters granted with unsettling eagerness, O'Brien discovered in their library a collection of texts that made his blood run cold. Original manuscripts that predated the Salem witch trials, written in a mixture of languages and symbols, dealing with practices that he recognized from his studies in Rome as belonging to cults suppressed by the early church, including one volume bound in an unusual scaled hide that seemed to shift color as he watched, which Constance identified casually as the Vermis Mysterious, a gift from Father's associates in Providence. O'Brien's report to Bishop Fitzgerald, submitted on December 13th, warned of practices that threaten not merely the souls of those involved, but the very fabric of Christian society in Salem, recommending immediate intervention by church authorities. Yet within 48 hours of submitting this report, Father O'Brien received orders for immediate reassignment to a remote mission in California, orders that bypassed normal church protocols and bore signatures he didn't recognize, leading him to write in his final journal entry, "They have reach, even within the church, and I am being silenced rather than supported. But I leave this record so that others might know that what dwells in the Beckett house wears the face of maidens, but serves masters older than Solomon's temple." Judge Cornelius Hathorne's decision to issue a warrant for the search of the Beckett property on December 15th, 1894, marked the first time in Salem's post-witch trial history that such extensive legal action had been taken based on suspicions of occult activities, the judge later noting in his private papers that the accumulated evidence had overcome his natural skepticism and forced him to confront the possibility that something genuinely evil had taken root in our city. The excavation began at dawn on December 16th, with Sheriff Holbrook leading a team of 20 men, including deputies, court officers, and laborers, recruited with difficulty once word spread of their destination, many showing reluctance to enter what local whispers had begun calling the Cursed House on Federal Street. The initial examination of the cellar revealed what appeared to be a standard storage area until Deputy Sullivan noticed that the eastern wall sounded hollow when struck, leading to the discovery of a concealed door that opened onto a descending passage carved directly into the bedrock, its walls bearing tool marks that geological consultant Professor Armitage dated as potentially centuries old, predating the current house by generations. The tunnel system that emerged as the excavation progressed defied both architectural logic and the known boundaries of the property. extending in a northeastern direction that Sheriff Holbrook realized with growing unease led directly toward the old Burying Point Cemetery, with secondary passages branching off into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light. At a depth of approximately 30 feet below the cellar floor, the main tunnel opened into a circular chamber roughly 25 feet in diameter, its contents causing several of the workers to flee immediately, while others fell to their knees in prayer, for arranged around the perimeter were human teeth, hundreds of them, set into the walls in patterns that created a grotesque mosaic depicting symbols that hurt to look upon directly. The center of the chamber contained what the official report would describe as artifacts of unknown purpose, though Deputy Sullivan's personal notes were more explicit, describing vessels of blown glass containing liquids that moved without external agitation, some appearing to be blood in various stages of decomposition, while others held substances that glowed with their own phosphorescence, and, most disturbing, several containers filled with what appeared to be preserved human organs arranged in configurations that suggested they were components of some larger working. The leather-bound books, discovered on stone shelves carved into the chamber walls, were written in various ciphers and unknown scripts, though one volume fell open to a page featuring anatomical drawings that Dr. Thornbury identified as showing surgical procedures that no legitimate medical text would contain. Operations designed not to heal, but to extract specific essences while maintaining the subject in a state of aware suffering. Throughout the excavation, Constance Beckett maintained perfect composure from where she watched with her sister from the garden, and when Sheriff Holbrook emerged to confront them with the evidence, she merely smiled and stated, "These are historical curiosities, Sheriff, remnants of Salem's true history that my family has preserved when others would see it forgotten, and you will find that nothing you have discovered violates any current law, for the old ways predate your modern statutes and will persist long after they are dust." The discovery of Silas Beckett's personal journals occurred entirely by accident on December 17, 1894, when Deputy O'Sullivan, searching for additional evidence in the mansion's study, noticed that measurements of the room's interior did not match its exterior dimensions, suggesting a hidden space within the walls that proved to contain 37 leather-bound volumes, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, bearing a signet that matched one found among Eleanor Beckett's effects. The journals, spanning from 1865 to just days before Silas's death in 1892, began with entries that revealed the family's true identity as descendants of the Blackwood family, whose patriarch, Josiah Blackwood, had been among those accused but never formally tried during the 1692 witch trials, having fled Salem with his pregnant wife Sarah and a collection of materials that would become the foundation of generations of dark practice. Silas's meticulous documentation of his family history included genealogical charts showing how the Blackwoods had changed their name first to Hartley, then to Beckett, moving throughout New England but always returning to Salem when the stars were right, maintaining connections with other families who had escaped the trials while harboring knowledge and practices that should have died. With the 17th century, the entries from 1879, when Silas returned to Salem, spoke of resuming the work interrupted 2 centuries ago and fulfilling bloodline obligations that cannot be denied without consequences too terrible to contemplate, describing rituals performed at specific dates that corresponded to astronomical events, rituals that required feeding the ancient hunger that our forebears awakened but could not control. Most disturbing were Silas's increasingly frantic entries from 1890 to 1891, regarding Eleanor's condition, revealing that her illness was no natural disease, but rather the result of her voluntary participation in what Silas called the preliminary consumption, a process by which she allowed herself to be slowly drained of what he termed essential vitalities to fuel preparations for a greater working. His entry from September 15th, 1891, the date of Eleanor's death, was written in a shaking hand. "It is done. Eleanor has been fully consumed by the working, as was always her destiny, her essence preserved in the vessels below, her sacrifice ensuring our daughters will have the power needed for the great summoning." Though watching her final dissolution, seeing her smile even as she ceased to be corporeal, feeling her consciousness transfer into the prepared containers, has broken something within me that will never heal. The later journals revealed detailed plans for what Silas called the grand culmination of 3 centuries preparation, involving his daughters, collecting specific bloodlines descended from Salem's original settlers, bloodlines that carried what he described as the taint of those who condemned us, whose descendants must now provide the fuel for our redemption. His final entries, written in February 1892, showed a man torn between pride in his daughter's dedication to their inherited purpose and horror at what he had set in motion. Constance shows the same cold devotion that marked her mother's final days, while Prudence exhibits an enthusiasm for the work that chills even my corrupted soul. And I realize too late that in preserving our family's purpose I have created something monstrous. For they speak of improvements to the ancient methods, of innovations that would horrify even our ancestors, and I fear that when the December of their choosing arrives, what they summon will not be the restoration of our family's power, but something far worse, something that should remain forever beyond the veil that separates our world from the hungry darkness that waits outside. The investigation into the Beckett sisters' educational background at the Whittier Academy for Young Ladies in Boston, undertaken by Sheriff Holbrook's correspondence with Boston authorities and a personal visit by Deputy Chief Morrison, revealed a pattern of disturbing events that suggested Constance and Prudence had been practicing their dark arts long before returning to Salem. The Academy's records, reluctantly provided by the current headmistress, Mrs. Pemberton, who insisted on legal compulsion before releasing any information, showed that the sisters had attended from 1885 to 1889, with Constance graduating with highest honors, while Prudence had left suddenly in her final year, under circumstances the official records described only as family obligations requiring immediate attention. The investigation deepened when Morrison discovered police reports from the period indicating that between 1887 and 1889, 5 students from Whittier Academy had vanished without trace, their disappearances attributed to elopements or voluntary departures, until Morrison's cross-referencing revealed that all 5 had been members of what Academy records obliquely referred to as an unauthorized study, a group that had been discovered and disbanded in late 1888. The most crucial testimony came from Miss Lillian Ashford, now Mrs. Lillian Pembroke of Beacon Hill, who had been a classmate of the Beckett sisters and who agreed to speak with Morrison only after he assured her that the sisters were under investigation and could no longer reach her. Mrs. Pembroke's account, given in a voice that still trembled with remembered fear despite the passage of years, described how a secret society had formed within the Academy, initially presented as a literary and philosophical discussion group, but which had quickly evolved into something far more sinister under the leadership of Constance Beckett. She possessed knowledge that no young woman should have, Mrs. Pembroke stated, speaking of texts and practices that predated Christianity, demonstrating abilities that defied natural law. such as causing candle flames to burn in colors that don't exist in nature, or making shadows move independently of their sources. Always with that terrible smile, as if our shock and fear pleased her immensely. The midnight gatherings, held in the Academy's abandoned East Wing, had begun as intellectual exercises but had progressed to actual rituals, with Prudence serving as her sister's eager assistant in ceremonies that Mrs. Pembroke could barely describe without becoming visibly distressed. They would draw symbols in the air that remained visible like smoke, speak words that made the temperature drop 20 degrees, and worst of all, they seemed to be teaching us, preparing us for some future purpose, marking those they deemed worthy with invisible signs that I swear I can still feel burning on my skin during certain lunar phases. The investigation revealed that 3 of the Society's members, Miss Catherine Thornfield, Miss Margaret Ashford, no relation to Lillian, and Miss Dorothy Blackwood, had been committed to asylums within a year of the Society's dissolution, all suffering from what attending physicians described as acute mania, characterized by speaking to unseen presences and claiming to be summoned by voices only they could hear. The Academy's records showed that after the Society's discovery, several faculty members had resigned abruptly, including the Latin mistress who had found the group in mid-ritual and who had left only a single-sentence resignation. There are things occurring in this institution that imperil immortal souls. Most disturbing was Morrison's discovery that the 5 missing students had all been orphans or charity cases, with no close family to pursue investigations. A pattern chillingly similar to the disappearances in Salem, suggesting that the Beckett sisters had been refining their selection of victims for years before returning to their ancestral home. The intensification of surveillance around the Beckett mansion, as December's new moon approached on the 21st, revealed a crescendo of activity that convinced Sheriff Holbrook and his men that whatever dark purpose the sisters had been working toward was reaching its culmination, with deputies reporting an endless stream of deliveries arriving at all hours, despite the sisters' apparent lack of normal household needs. Deputy Sullivan's logbook documented the arrivals with growing alarm. December 14th saw 3 covered wagons arrive between midnight and dawn, their drivers hooded and silent, refusing to answer questions and producing paperwork that seemed to shift and blur when examined closely, while December 16th brought crates from the docks, bearing shipping marks from ports that Harbormaster Williams insisted did not exist on any maritime charts, crates that required 6 men to move, despite their modest size, and which emanated cold that frosted the ground beneath them, even in the relative warmth of the afternoon. The reports from Salem's vagrant population, collected by Deputy O'Brien, who had cultivated informants among the city's destitute, revealed that agents of the Beckett sisters had been moving through the poorhouses and dock areas, offering extraordinary sums, up to $50, for participation in what was described as a historical reenactment of Salem's founding traditions, with the peculiar requirements that participants be without family connections and willing to travel to a designated location on the night of December 21st. Thomas Cork Murphy, a longtime resident of the docks who had initially accepted the offer before his survival instincts overwhelmed his greed, reported to O'Brien that the recruitment was being conducted by men whose faces were wrong somehow, like masks that didn't quite fit, and when one smiled at me, I saw too many teeth and ran despite needing that money more than life itself. The investigation took on new urgency when city records revealed that the Beckett sisters had been systematically purchasing properties in a ring around Gallows Hill, using different attorneys and shell companies, but always paying in gold coins that banks reported were of unusual age and composition, creating a perimeter of control around the site of the 1,692 executions that historian Professor Whitman described as forming a ritual boundary consistent with practices described in certain forbidden texts. The December 18th discovery of Martha Prescott's body in her locked boarding house room sent waves of fear through those connected to the investigation, with the attending physician Dr. Morrison noting that while the death appeared to be suicide by poison, the expression frozen on her face was one of transcendent terror rather than the peace often seen in voluntary death, and clutched in her rigid fingers was a piece of paper on which she had scrawled with apparent desperation the single word, convergence, repeated 17 times in increasingly erratic script. Her landlady, Mrs. Patterson, reported that Prescott had been increasingly agitated in the days before her death, speaking of being called by voices that wear familiar faces but speak with the accent of the void, and had been observed at her window at all hours watching the street as if expecting some terrible arrival, leading Sheriff Holbrook to conclude that whatever knowledge Prescott had possessed about the Beckett household had ultimately made her continued existence incompatible with the sisters' plans for December 21st. The night of December 21st, 1894, began with an unnatural stillness that settled over Salem like a burial shroud, broken at precisely 10 o'clock by the sound of bells that no church in the city possessed, a deep bronze tolling that seemed to rise from the earth itself and sent citizens retreating behind locked doors and drawn curtains, though many would later report an irresistible compulsion to peer through windows at what followed. The procession began at the Beckett mansion, witnessed by the team of constables Sheriff Holbrook had positioned at strategic points, though their careful planning would prove woefully inadequate for what they observed, with Deputy Sullivan's report describing approximately 30 figures in dark robes emerging from the house in perfect synchronization, moving not as individuals, but as components of a single organism, their footsteps producing no sound despite the frozen ground. The hooded figures proceeded through Salem's streets in a formation that Professor Whitman would later identify as matching stellar configurations from ancient astronomical texts, with the Beckett sisters at the center of the group, distinguished by robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And by the way, the other figures oriented themselves around them like iron filings to a magnet. Constable Patrick Murphy, stationed at the corner of Federal and Essex streets, reported that as the procession passed, the gas street lamps dimmed and flickered, while the air itself became viscous and difficult to breathe, causing him to struggle against an overwhelming urge to join the marchers, an urge he resisted only by driving his police whistle into his palm until blood flowed. The procession's route to Gallows Hill traced a path that connected sites of the 1,692 executions, and at each location, the group paused while the sisters performed gestures that caused the very fabric of reality to ripple, with witnesses describing shadows that detached from their sources to dance independently, voices that spoke from empty air in languages that predated human speech, and most terrifying, glimpses of spaces between spaces where things moved that the human eye refused to fully register. By the time the procession reached Gallows Hill, several constables had fled their posts in naked terror, while others would be found hours later in catatonic states, their minds apparently unable to process what they had witnessed, with Dr. Morrison noting that 3 officers required immediate commitment to asylum care after being discovered, attempting to claw out their own eyes while babbling about the convergence of angles that should not meet. The ritual itself, observed from a distance by Sheriff Holbrook and the remaining officers who maintained their sanity through sheer force of will and repeated prayers, centered on the spot where the sisters had prepared their elaborate circle, with the 30 participants arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive directly, their chanting creating harmonics that caused blood to flow from the ears of those who heard it, while above them, the December moon began to take on a color and quality that no celestial body should possess, appearing to pulse and writhe as if something vast was pressing against it from the other side of the sky. Seeking entry into our world through the gateway, the Beckett sisters were methodically constructing with their inherited knowledge and carefully harvested materials. The dawn of December 22nd, 1894, broke gray and reluctant over Salem, as if the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate what had transpired during the night, with the first witnesses being early morning workers who reported an unnatural warmth emanating from the direction of Gallows Hill, despite the December cold, accompanied by a smell they described variously as burnt copper mixed with flowers that shouldn't bloom in winter. Sheriff Holbrook, who had maintained his vigil through the night, despite losing 7 officers to madness or flight, led the initial investigation team to the site at first light, where they discovered a transformation of the landscape so profound that surveyor Marcus Webb would later testify he needed to verify his position by multiple landmarks to believe he stood on familiar ground. The earth itself had been altered in a perfect circle 50 feet in diameter, with symbols burned into the soil to a depth of 6 inches, the heat required for such marking having been so intense that the ground had vitrified in places, creating patches of black glass that reflected not the morning sky, but what Deputy Sullivan swore were other skies with stars that moved. Within this circle, arranged in spirals that drew the eye inward despite conscious resistance, were the personal effects of the ritual participants. Robes discarded as if their wearers had simply ceased to exist within them. Shoes still positioned as if in mid-stride, and most disturbing, 30 small piles of what Dr. Morrison identified as residue of unknown composition, organic, yet unlike any tissue I have encountered, as if human matter had been reduced to its most essential components and then partially translated into something else. Of the Beckett sisters and their followers, no trace remained, save for these artifacts, and a single leather journal left precisely at the circle's center, its pages unmarked, except for the final entry written in Constance Beckett's precise hand. The working is complete at last. 3 centuries of preparation, culminating in this moment of convergence when the barriers thin sufficiently for translation. And we go now to join those who wait beyond the angles of customary space, having paid the price in carefully harvested essence and willing flesh, leaving behind only these words as testament that what the ignorant call death is merely transformation for those who know the true names of things that dwell between the stars. The Beckett mansion, when entered by authorities later that morning, presented a mystery within a mystery, appearing not as the well-maintained home that had received deliveries just hours before, but as a structure abandoned for decades, with dust thick on every surface, furniture covered in sheets that crumbled at a touch, and an atmosphere of decay so profound that several officers refused to proceed beyond the entrance hall, while those who did venture deeper reported that certain rooms seemed to exist in different states of temporal decay simultaneously, as if time itself had become uncertain within the walls. The investigation's final accounting revealed a total of 47 individuals missing. The 3 original seamstresses, 7 other young women connected to the Beckett household, the 30 ritual participants identified through various witness accounts, and 7 others, including delivery men and workers who had been seen entering the property in the final days but never emerged. Their fates, presumably tied to the grand working the sisters had orchestrated, though what precisely had become of them remained a mystery that would haunt Salem for generations to come. The collapse of the official investigation into the Beckett sisters and the events of December 21st began within hours of the discovery at Gallows Hill, with Sheriff Holbrook receiving a telegram from Governor Greenhalgh's office ordering an immediate cessation of all public statements regarding the matter. followed by the arrival of state officials who showed more interest in controlling information than investigating the disappearances. By December 24th, key pieces of evidence began vanishing from police custody under circumstances that defied explanation. The photographs taken at Gallows Hill were found to be blank, despite multiple officers witnessing their development. The leather journal containing Constance Beckett's final message disappeared from a locked evidence room with no sign of forced entry. And most disturbing, the residue samples collected from the ritual site were discovered to have transformed overnight into ordinary sand, as if they had never been anything else. Witnesses who had provided detailed testimony began retracting their statements with suspicious uniformity, claiming tricks of light, mass hysteria, or simple misunderstanding, with Deputy Sullivan submitting a revised report, stating he had seen nothing more than vagrants conducting a harmless gathering, that excitement and darkness had transformed in our minds. Though his colleagues noted his hands shook as he signed the document, and he refused to meet anyone's eyes. The pressure on Sheriff Holbrook intensified when federal agents arrived on December 26th, presenting credentials from departments he had never heard of, and authority that superseded all local jurisdiction, conducting private interviews with every officer involved in the investigation, and emerging with signed statements that contradicted all previous reports. Holbrook's resignation on December 28th was presented as voluntary, citing exhaustion and the need for extended rest, though his wife would later tell close friends that he had been given a choice between resignation with pension intact or charges of inciting public panic with fabricated reports of supernatural events, a threat backed by the mysteriously altered evidence that now showed nothing more sinister than the Beckett sisters' departure for an extended European tour. The official report, filed on December 30th and immediately classified, concluded that the Beckett sisters had left Salem for cultural pursuits abroad, that the missing women had sought employment elsewhere without informing relatives, and that the events of December 21st had been a combination of winter festivities and overactive imaginations, fueled by Salem's historical associations, with all evidence to the contrary sealed under a federal order that prohibited access for 100 years. The Beckett mansion was quietly transferred to federal ownership and left to decay, while officers who attempted to speak publicly about what they had witnessed found themselves facing professional ruin, unexplained accidents, or, in 3 cases, commitment to asylums for persistent delusions, creating a wall of silence around the events that would prove remarkably effective. By January 1895, the only remaining evidence of the Beckett investigation existed in private journals, whispered stories, and the memories of those who had witnessed things that official history would deny, while Salem itself seemed eager to forget, as if the city collectively understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, and some truths too terrible to acknowledge in the light of day. The decade following the Beckett sisters' disappearance witnessed a persistent pattern of disturbances that suggested whatever they had accomplished on that December night had left permanent scars on the fabric of Salem's reality, beginning with the Hutchinson family's ill-fated attempt to purchase and renovate the Beckett mansion in March 1895. Lasting only 17 days before fleeing the property after what they described in a lawsuit against the real estate agent as manifestations that violate both natural law and human sanity. Their testimony, given before the sale was quietly voided and the property returned to federal custody, described voices that spoke from within the walls in languages that predated human speech, shadows in mirrors that moved independently and appeared to be reaching through the glass, and a persistent sensation of being observed by intelligences that existed in spaces between the normal angles of rooms, with Mrs. Hutchinson suffering a complete nervous collapse after claiming to have seen Prudence Beckett's face forming in the pattern of mold on the cellar wall, smiling and mouthing words that, though silent, somehow conveyed meaning directly to the mind. The pattern repeated with subsequent attempts to utilize properties the sisters had purchased around Gallows Hill. The Morehouse family lasted 6 months in the Charter Street property before abandoning it after their daughter Amy began speaking in tongues that Professor Whitman identified as matching phonetically with pre-Sumerian incantations, while the Essex Street house saw 3 different owners between 1896 and 1898, each reporting escalating phenomena that culminated in the third owner, banker Charles Pemberton, being found catatonic in the garden, having apparently attempted to dig down to what he later described as the tunnels where they've always been waiting. The 1899 discovery during renovation of the Federal Street property of a previously unknown room sealed behind a false wall added another layer to the mystery, containing 3 mummified corpses in positions suggesting they had been alive when entombed, their identities never established despite extensive investigation, though workers reported that the bodies appeared to have been partially transformed, with bone structures that deviated from human norms in subtle but disturbing ways, as if they had been caught in the process of becoming something else. The sporadic disappearances that plagued Salem through 1904 followed patterns disturbingly reminiscent of the Beckett era. Young women without family connections vanishing near the old properties, vagrants disappearing from areas around Gallows Hill, and most troubling, the 1902 case of the Whitmore triplets, age 7, who vanished from their nursery in a house that backed onto the former Beckett garden, leaving behind only their nightclothes arranged as if the children had simply evaporated within them. The revelation that would truly demonstrate the continuing nature of the threat came in 1903, when genealogist Dr. Edmund Harcourt, researching New England colonial families, discovered through painstaking analysis of birth records, ship manifests, and property deeds that the Blackwood divided by Beckett bloodline had not ended with the sisters' disappearance, but had dispersed throughout New England under at least 12 different surnames, with descendants occupying positions of influence in Boston, Providence, Hartford, and Portland, all maintaining correspondence through coded advertisements in newspapers, and all purchasing properties in specific geographic patterns that Harcourt realized were slowly recreating on a larger scale the same ritual boundary the sisters had established around Gallows Hill, leading him to seal his research and flee to California after receiving a visit from a young woman claiming to be Constance Beckett's grandniece, who smiled with too many teeth and left frost on every surface she touched, despite the July heat.